The wilderness gives meat, silence, freedom, but it also takes. Every seasoned hunter knows that beyond the tree line, something always watches, whether it's tooth, claw, or something far stranger. These are true stories from men who didn't just hunt, but were hunted, challenged, or left changed forever by what they encountered. In this video, we explore 6 terrifying encounters from deep in the wild, where nature wasn't the only predator. From a record-breaking grizzly in British Columbia to an unseen stalker in the forests of Idaho, watch as the stories unfold. Northern British Columbia, Canada, September 2025. Dense spruce forest. The dense spruce forests of northern British Columbia had witnessed countless hunting expeditions over the decades, but none quite like what Grayson McCallum and Tyler Givens would experience in the early autumn of 2025. This remote wilderness, stretching endlessly between the Pacific coastal ranges, had been home to some of Canada's most formidable wildlife for centuries. The area was known among seasoned hunters for its unpredictable weather patterns, thick underbrush, and the occasional sighting of massive grizzly bears that seemed to grow larger in these untouched territories than anywhere else in North America. Grayson McCallum, a weathered 58-year-old hunter from Alberta, had been tracking moose through these woods for over 3 decades. His calloused hands and sharp eyes spoke of countless successful hunts, though he would often joke that the moose were getting smarter while he was getting older. Tyler Givens, his 24-year-old nephew, had joined him on this particular expedition as part of what Grayson called his hunting education. The younger man possessed enthusiasm that reminded Grayson of his own early days in the wilderness, though Tyler still jumped at every snapping twig and rustling bush. They had established their base camp along a winding riverbank known for late rutting activity, where bull moose traditionally gathered during the mating season. The location offered fresh water, decent cover, and multiple escape routes should weather or wildlife present unexpected challenges. Their lightweight aluminum canoe sat pulled up on the muddy bank, loaded with extra supplies and serving as their backup transportation method. The early September frost had already begun settling into the lower elevations, creating that crisp morning air that experienced hunters knew signaled the beginning of prime hunting season. On their 3rd morning, after 2 days of tracking promising moose signs without success, both men rose before dawn and prepared for what they hoped would be a productive stalk. The forest remained eerily quiet as they moved through the underbrush, following fresh tracks that led deeper into the spruce grove. Tyler carried his rifle with the nervous energy of someone still learning to trust his instincts, while Grayson moved with the confident silence of a man who had spent more time in these woods than most people spent in their own homes. The encounter happened suddenly, as most unexpected wildlife meetings do. They had been following what appeared to be a well-used game trail when the vegetation ahead of them began rustling with unusual intensity. Grayson immediately signaled for Tyler to stop, both men freezing in place as they tried to identify what was causing the disturbance. The sound was too heavy for a moose, too deliberate for wind, and too consistent for a smaller animal. What emerged from the thick spruce cover defied both men's expectations and experience. The grizzly bear that slowly revealed itself stood larger than any animal either hunter had encountered in decades of wilderness expeditions. When the massive creature reared up on its hind legs, it towered nearly 10 feet above the forest floor, its enormous frame blocking out significant portions of the morning sky. The bear's coat appeared thick and lustrous, indicating excellent health and abundant feeding throughout the summer months. Tyler found himself completely paralyzed by the sight, his rifle trembling in his hands as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. His legs felt weak, and he later admitted that keeping his footing required considerable effort. The young hunter had prepared for many possible encounters during their trip, but nothing had prepared him for facing an animal of such intimidating proportions. Grayson, despite his decades of experience, found himself equally stunned by the bear's size. His initial instinct was to raise his rifle, but disbelief kept his weapon lowered as he tried to comprehend the massive creature before them. The veteran hunter had encountered dozens of grizzly bears throughout his career, but none had approached the sheer bulk and presence of this particular animal. The bear's behavior proved as surprising as its size. Rather than displaying the aggressive posturing typical of surprised grizzlies, the animal simply stared at both hunters with what appeared to be calm curiosity, It released a deep, rumbling breath that seemed to echo through the forest, then began a slow, deliberate circle around their position. The bear maintained a distance of roughly 50 yards, never approaching closer but clearly assessing the two humans who had wandered into its territory. After several tense minutes of this circling behavior, the grizzly simply turned and wandered back into the dense spruce cover, disappearing as quietly as it had appeared. Both men remained frozen for several additional minutes, listening for any indication that the bear might return or that other animals were in the immediate area. When they finally felt safe enough to move, Grayson and Tyler decided to return to their base camp rather than continue tracking moose. The encounter had left both men shaken and unwilling to venture deeper into territory that clearly belonged to such a formidable predator. However, upon reaching their campsite, they discovered that their cautious retreat had been unnecessary, as the bear had already visited their location. Their food stores had been completely destroyed, with containers torn apart and contents scattered throughout the camping area. Most disturbing were the deep gouges left in their aluminum canoe, claw marks that indicated the bear possessed not only enormous size but tremendous strength. The damage suggested the animal had investigated their camp thoroughly, likely while they were away on their morning hunt. Grayson immediately used his radio to report the sighting once they returned to civilization. Wildlife officials who later investigated the scene confirmed that the tracks and hair samples suggested a bear weighing over 1,500 pounds, potentially the largest grizzly ever recorded on Canadian soil. The incident marked the first time in Grayson's hunting career that he had returned home early, and he quietly upgraded to heavy-duty food containers for all future expeditions. Outside Thermopolis, Wyoming, October 2011, Ashrock Pine Ridge. The rugged terrain surrounding Thermopolis, Wyoming had earned its reputation among hunters as both rewarding and treacherous. The rocky pinewood ridges that stretched across this part of the state offered excellent elk habitat, with dense timber providing cover and natural water sources supporting healthy herds. Local hunting guides often warned visitors about the unpredictable weather patterns that could sweep through these high elevations, transforming a routine hunt into a survival situation within hours. Mason Teller, a 44-year-old hunter from Colorado, had been planning this controlled elk hunt for months. His hunting partner, Eric Sandberg, shared his enthusiasm for the challenging terrain and the promise of encountering mature bull elk during the peak of rutting season. Both men possessed considerable hunting experience, though neither had previously hunted in this particular region of Wyoming. The October weather proved as unpredictable as local guides had warned. Stiff winds carried the scent of approaching winter, while icy trails made footing treacherous on the steep ridges. Despite these challenging conditions, both hunters felt optimistic when they detected the distant bugling of bull elk echoing through the thinning aspen groves. Their tracking efforts led them higher into the rocky terrain, following fresh sign that indicated a substantial 6-point bull had passed through the area recently. The elk's tracks showed clear definition in the soft soil near water sources, and rubs on nearby trees suggested the animal was actively marking territory during the rut. The first encounter with wildlife came unexpectedly as they navigated a particularly dense section of pine timber. A lone black bear emerged from the underbrush, initially showing little interest in the two hunters. The animal appeared focused on foraging, probably preparing for winter hibernation by consuming the last available berries and vegetation. Mason and Eric maintained their distance, allowing the bear to continue its activities without interference. Both men understood that black bears typically avoided human contact unless threatened or defending cubs. After several minutes of mutual observation, the bear wandered deeper into the timber and the hunters continued their elk tracking. Their patience paid off later that afternoon when they successfully located and harvested the 6-point bull they had been pursuing. The animal proved to be a mature specimen, providing excellent meat for both hunters' families. They began the process of field dressing their elk as evening approached, working efficiently to preserve the meat quality. The scent of blood from their field dressing activities apparently attracted unwanted attention. As darkness began settling over the ridge, the same black bear they had encountered earlier returned to their location. This time, however, the animal displayed aggressive behavior, clearly drawn by the smell of fresh meat. Eric was positioning himself to help drag the elk carcass when the bear made its approach. The animal moved with surprising speed for its size, forcing Eric to scramble for cover on the rocky terrain. During his hasty retreat, Eric lost his footing on the icy rocks and felt his shoulder separate with a sharp pop that sent waves of pain through his arm. Mason reacted quickly to the dangerous situation, raising his .308 rifle and firing 3 warning shots in rapid succession. The loud reports echoed across the ridge, creating enough noise and confusion to discourage the bear from pressing its attack. The animal retreated into the timber, though both hunters suspected it remained nearby. With Eric's shoulder clearly dislocated and the bear potentially still in the area, Mason made the difficult decision to transport their elk meat in multiple trips rather than risk another encounter. The process required 3 separate journeys down the treacherous ridge, with Mason constantly scanning for signs of the bear's return. Throughout the entire meat recovery operation, both hunters remained on high alert, jumping at every sound and constantly checking their surroundings. The paranoia proved exhausting, but they successfully transported all their elk meat to their vehicle without further incident. Eric spent the following week wearing a sling while his shoulder healed, a constant reminder of how quickly a successful hunt could turn dangerous. Mason later admitted that the encounter had fundamentally changed his approach to hunting in bear country. He invested in bear spray as backup protection and vowed never again to dress game without maintaining a proper lookout. The experience taught both men valuable lessons about wildlife behavior and the importance of being prepared for unexpected encounters. Their successful elk hunt had been overshadowed by the reminder that humans were not the only predators in these Wyoming highlands, and that respecting wildlife meant understanding the risks that came with sharing their habitat. John Day, Oregon, August 1998, High Desert Pine Country. The high desert pine country near John Day, Oregon represented some of the most isolated hunting territory in the Pacific Northwest. This region, characterized by sparse pine forests scattered across rolling hills and deep canyons, had been home to substantial mule deer populations for generations. The area's reputation among hunters included stories of exceptional trophy bucks, but also warnings about easy navigation errors in terrain that could look identical for miles in any direction. Joel Myers, a 36-year-old bow hunter from Portland, had convinced his older brother Calvin to join him for a late summer mule deer hunt in this remote country. Both brothers possessed considerable hunting experience, though neither had previously ventured into this particular area of Oregon. They had spent months preparing for the expedition, studying topographical maps and planning their approach to areas that showed promise for mature bucks. Their hunting strategy relied heavily on modern GPS technology, a relatively new tool that promised to eliminate the navigation problems that had plagued hunters in this region for decades. The brothers felt confident that their electronic equipment would prevent them from experiencing the confusion that had led other hunters to become lost in the seemingly endless pine forests. The first indication of trouble came when their GPS unit began displaying erratic readings on their second morning. The device showed their location jumping between coordinates that placed them miles apart, despite the fact that they had been following the same trail for hours. Joel initially attributed the malfunction to dead batteries, but replacing them failed to resolve the problem. More disturbing than the GPS failure was the gradual realization that the trail they had been following no longer existed. The path that had been clearly defined that morning had disappeared into dense brush that appeared to have been established for years. Neither brother could explain how they had missed such obvious changes in the terrain. Their attempts to retrace their steps proved equally confusing. Landmarks that should have been visible from their current position had vanished, while new rock formations and vegetation seemed to have appeared overnight. The brothers began to suspect that they had somehow taken a wrong turn, though neither could identify when or where such a mistake might have occurred. The forest around them was alive with typical wilderness sounds throughout the day. Branches creaked in the wind, creating rhythmic clicking noises that echoed through the pine canopy. Small animals rustled through the underbrush, causing twigs to snap with sharp reports. Chipmunks and squirrels chattered in the distance, while woodpeckers hammered against dead trees. Though these sounds were entirely normal for the forest environment, the brothers found them unsettling in their disoriented state. Joel's hunting instincts told him that something was fundamentally wrong with their navigation situation, though he struggled to identify specific reasons for his growing unease. The forest felt disorienting, as if they had entered an area where their usual woodland skills were inadequate. That evening, Joel spotted what appeared to be another hunter standing motionless near a pile of rocks approximately 50 yards from their position. The figure wore camouflage clothing and seemed to be observing their movements with deliberate attention. Joel assumed another hunter had wandered into the same area and decided to approach the individual to compare notes about local game activity. However, when Joel reached the rock pile, no one was there. The camouflage figure had simply moved on, disappearing into the thick timber before Joel could make contact. Calvin confirmed that he had also seen the other hunter, but the person had clearly decided to avoid contact and had moved deeper into the forest. The following morning brought additional navigation problems when their compasses began spinning wildly, unable to settle on magnetic north. Both instruments had been recently calibrated and had functioned properly throughout previous hunting trips. The compass malfunction was likely caused by a local magnetic anomaly in the area, a geological phenomenon that occasionally occurred in regions with high mineral content. The compass failure left them without any reliable means of determining direction in terrain that offered few distinctive landmarks. During their attempts to establish their location, Calvin discovered trail markers carved into the bark of a large pine tree. The markings appeared to be old blazes left by previous hunters or forestry workers, though neither brother could interpret their specific meaning. The carvings showed signs of weathering, with darkened sap visible around the cuts, suggesting they had been made several seasons earlier by someone familiar with the area. After spending another half-day wandering in circles through increasingly unfamiliar terrain, the brothers made the difficult decision to abandon their planned route entirely. They chose to force their way through a steep canyon wall, rather than continue following trails that seemed to lead nowhere. The canyon descent proved challenging and dangerous, but eventually brought them back to terrain that their maps and instruments could accurately identify. Once they reached familiar ground, their GPS and compasses resumed normal operation, and they were able to navigate back to their vehicle without further incident. Joel never discussed the experience with other hunters, preferring to file it away as one of those challenging navigation experiences that sometimes occurred in remote wilderness areas. Calvin described the location as one of those places where it was easy to become disoriented, and both brothers agreed to avoid hunting in that region during future expeditions. The incident served as a reminder that despite modern technology and careful planning, the wilderness still held navigational challenges that required experience and caution to overcome. Waycross, Georgia, December 2003. Swampland Edges. The swampland edges near Waycross, Georgia had developed a reputation among southern hunters as prime wild boar territory. These transitional zones between dry pine forests and true wetlands provided an ideal habitat for the massive feral hogs that had been expanding their range throughout the southeastern United States. The area's thick undergrowth and abundant food sources supported boar populations that included specimens reaching extraordinary sizes, though hunting them required specialized knowledge of their behavior and habitat preferences. James Callahan, known to his hunting companions as JT, had been pursuing wild boar in these Georgia swamps for over 30 years. At 51 years old, he possessed the kind of intimate knowledge of boar behavior that only came from decades of tracking these dangerous animals through some of the most challenging terrain in the South. His weathered hands and scarred forearms testified to previous encounters with cornered boar, experiences that had taught him to respect their speed and aggression. For this particular December hunt, JT had agreed to bring along Riley Buchanan, the 16-year-old son of his cousin, for the teenager's first serious wild boar expedition. Riley had been begging for the opportunity to hunt these legendary animals, and JT finally decided the boy was old enough to handle the responsibility that came with pursuing such dangerous game. Their hunting strategy involved establishing bait sites near natural water sources, then using the thick brush as cover while waiting for the boar to approach. JT carried his trusted Remington 870 shotgun, a weapon he had relied on for decades of successful hunts. Riley carried a similar model, though his nervous energy revealed his inexperience with high-stakes hunting situations. The December weather proved ideal for their expedition, with cool temperatures that encouraged boar movement during daylight hours. JT had established several bait sites over the previous week, and trail cameras confirmed that multiple large boars were visiting the locations regularly. The setup promised an educational and successful hunt for Riley's introduction to wild boar hunting. Their target presented itself on the second evening as a massive boar that emerged from the cypress trees near their primary bait site. The animal showed obvious battle scars from previous encounters, most notably a missing tusk that gave its face a distinctive asymmetrical appearance. JT estimated the boar's weight at well over 400 pounds, making it one of the largest specimens he had encountered in recent years. The situation turned dangerous when their positioning inadvertently cornered the boar between their location and the water source it had been approaching. Wild boar, when trapped or threatened, were known to charge rather than retreat, and this particular animal displayed the aggressive body language that JT had learned to recognize as a warning sign. Riley's inexperience became apparent when his rifle's safety mechanism jammed at the critical moment. The teenager struggled with the weapon as the boar lowered its head and prepared to charge, a behavior that JT recognized as immediately preceding an attack. The veteran hunter knew that he had only seconds to prevent a potentially fatal encounter. JT fired at point-blank range, his shotgun blast catching the boar in the neck area. However, the animal's momentum and adrenaline allowed it to continue its charge despite the serious wound. The massive boar slammed into JT with tremendous force, knocking him backward into the muddy ground near the cypress trees. The impact left JT temporarily stunned and covered in the thick black mud that characterized the swampland edges. Riley, who had been frozen with panic since his safety jammed, suddenly found himself facing a wounded and enraged boar that showed no signs of slowing down despite its injury. JT shouted instructions to Riley from his position in the mud, directing the teenager to chamber a fresh shell and take a clean shot at the boar. The urgency in the older hunter's voice finally broke through Riley's panic, and the boy managed to operate his weapon properly. Riley's second shot proved more effective than J.T. S initial blast, striking the boar in a vital area that finally brought the animal down. The massive creature collapsed less than 10 feet from where JT lay in the cypress mud, its final movement stirring up additional muck that left both hunters covered in swamp debris. When they finally managed to drag the boar to higher ground for weighing, the scales registered 437 pounds, confirming J.T. S estimate that they had encountered an exceptionally large specimen. The animal's size and aggression had created a hunting experience that neither participant would soon forget. JT later joked that Riley's baptism into serious hunting had involved more mud than bullets, though the teenager had ultimately performed well under extreme pressure. The experience had taught Riley valuable lessons about remaining calm during dangerous situations and the importance of maintaining his equipment properly. More seriously, JT quietly upgraded their first aid supplies for future hunting expeditions, acknowledging that encounters with wounded wild boar could easily result in serious injuries. The incident served as a reminder that hunting dangerous game required not just skill and experience, but also preparation for worst-case scenarios that could develop without warning. Butte, Montana, February 1987, mountainous timberline. The mountainous regions surrounding Butte, Montana were notorious for their harsh winter conditions and unpredictable weather patterns. These high-elevation areas near the Continental Divide could experience temperature swings of 40 degrees within hours, while wind patterns carried moisture that created sudden whiteout conditions. Experienced hunters knew that winter expeditions in this terrain required extensive preparation and respect for the mountain's ability to turn deadly without warning. Doug Harmon, a 39-year-old trapper and hunter from Missoula, had been working these mountains for over 15 years. His winter expeditions typically focused on scouting elk movement patterns and checking trap lines, activities that required him to cover vast distances across challenging terrain. Doug's experience had taught him to read weather signs and navigate by landmarks that remained visible even during Montana's notorious winter storms. February of 1987 had already proven unusually harsh, with temperatures consistently dropping below zero and snowfall totals exceeding normal seasonal averages. Despite these challenging conditions, Doug decided to undertake a solo scouting expedition to document elk movement patterns in preparation for the following autumn's hunting season. His equipment load reflected the serious nature of winter mountain travel. Doug carried his reliable .270 rifle, multiple layers of thermal clothing, a battery-powered radio, and snowshoes designed for the deep powder conditions typical of high-elevation Montana winters. His pack also included emergency shelter materials and enough food for a planned 3-day expedition. The first 2 days of his trip proceeded according to plan, with Doug successfully documenting elk sign and checking several trap locations. The weather remained cold but stable, and he felt confident in his ability to navigate the familiar terrain despite the heavy snow cover that obscured many traditional landmarks. His problems began on the third morning when he decided to investigate elk activity in a drainage system that lay slightly outside his planned route. The detour seemed reasonable at the time, as the additional distance involved only a few miles of travel through terrain that appeared similar to areas he had navigated successfully for years. However, the overnight wind patterns had been stronger than Doug initially realized. The gusting air had not only filled in his previous day's tracks, but it also redistributed snow in ways that dramatically altered the landscape's appearance. Terrain features that should have been recognizable had been obscured by wind-driven snow, while new drifts created false landmarks that led him further from his intended route. Doug's realization that he had lost his way came gradually, as small navigation errors compounded into serious disorientation. The radio that should have provided emergency communication remained silent, apparently unable to reach any repeater stations from his current location. His compass readings seemed consistent, but without recognizable landmarks to confirm his position, the instrument provided little practical guidance. By nightfall, with temperatures dropping well below zero, Doug accepted that he would need to establish an emergency shelter rather than continue traveling in darkness. His survival training had emphasized the importance of conserving energy and maintaining body heat when lost in winter conditions, lessons that now proved invaluable. Using his emergency tarp and natural materials, Doug constructed a snow cave that would provide protection from the wind and help retain his body heat throughout the night. The shelter construction required significant energy, but created a microenvironment that would allow him to survive the sub-zero temperatures that characterized Montana winter nights. For the next 2 days, Doug carefully rationed his water supply while attempting to determine his location through systematic observation of the surrounding terrain. The distant sound of snowmobiles provided occasional hope, and he used these acoustic clues to try triangulating his position relative to known travel routes. His navigation efforts finally succeeded when he discovered a set of his own boot prints that had been partially preserved under a snowdrift. The tracks were barely visible, half buried beneath fresh powder, but they provided the directional reference he needed to retrace his route back toward familiar territory. The journey back to his base camp required another full day of travel through deep snow, with Doug using his snowshoes to break trail through powder that often reached his waist. His physical condition had deteriorated during the ordeal, and he arrived at his camp suffering from mild frostbite on his extremities and significant dehydration. When Doug finally returned to civilization, he discovered that the combination of extreme cold and dehydration had affected his judgment more severely than he had realized during the experience. The incident prompted him to reassess his approach to solo winter expeditions and invest in more sophisticated navigation equipment. Doug continued his hunting and trapping activities in the Montana mountains, but never again attempted winter expeditions without carrying a full GPS unit and backup radio equipment. He often told his hunting companions that Montana winters would bury a person faster than bullets could fly, a reminder that respected the mountain's power to transform familiar territory into a life-threatening maze of snow and wind. Central Idaho, September 2008. Remote fir forest. The remote fir forests of central Idaho represented some of the most isolated wilderness territory remaining in the continental United States. These dense timber stands, broken by occasional meadows and creek bottoms, provided habitat for diverse wildlife populations, while remaining largely untouched by human development. The region's reputation among hunters included stories of exceptional white-tailed deer, but also warnings about the psychological challenges of spending extended periods in such complete isolation. Craig Benson, a 42-year-old hunter from Boise, had been planning this early-season whitetail expedition for months. His longtime hunting partner, Luke Fisher, shared his enthusiasm for pursuing deer in areas where human pressure remained minimal. Both men possessed extensive backcountry experience and felt confident in their ability to handle the challenges of hunting in remote wilderness areas. The two hunters had been friends since college, bonding over their shared love of the outdoors and their desire to escape the increasingly crowded hunting areas closer to civilization. Craig worked as a construction foreman, his weathered hands and keen eye for detail making him particularly skilled at reading animal sign and navigating difficult terrain. Luke, a high school biology teacher, brought scientific curiosity to their expeditions, often identifying plant species and wildlife behaviors that enhanced their understanding of the ecosystem they were hunting. Their chosen hunting location lay miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking through dense timber and crossing multiple creek systems. The isolation promised excellent hunting opportunities, but also meant that they would be completely self-sufficient for the duration of their expedition. Their camp was established in a small clearing that provided adequate space for their tent while offering natural wind protection from the surrounding fir trees. The hike had taken them nearly 6 hours, their heavy packs loaded with enough supplies for a week-long expedition. The trail, barely visible in places, wound through towering Douglas firs and across boulder-strewn creek beds that tested their balance and endurance. As they gained elevation, the forest grew thicker, the canopy overhead filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns that danced across the forest floor. Setting up camp required careful consideration of water access, wind protection, and sight lines for security. They chose a spot near a small creek that provided fresh water while offering multiple escape routes if needed. The surrounding fir trees created a natural windbreak, and the clearing was large enough to accommodate their tent and cooking area without feeling cramped. The first 2 days of their hunt proceeded normally, with both hunters observing promising deer sign and enjoying the solitude that came with hunting in such remote territory. The September weather remained stable, and they felt optimistic about their chances of encountering mature whitetail bucks in the relatively undisturbed habitat. During those initial days, they established a comfortable routine. Craig would wake before dawn to scout the eastern ridges, while Luke explored the creek bottoms where deer commonly traveled to water. They would meet back at camp during the midday hours to share observations and plan their afternoon strategies. The deer sign they discovered was encouraging: fresh tracks in the mud near water sources, rubs on small trees where bucks had scraped the velvet from their antlers, and well-used trails that suggested regular animal movement through the area. The forest itself seemed almost alive with subtle sounds and movements. Squirrels chattered in the branches overhead, woodpeckers drummed against dead snags, and the occasional rustle of brush indicated the presence of small game. Both hunters felt a deep connection to this pristine environment, far removed from the noise and stress of their daily lives in Boise. Their sense of security began to change on the third night when they started hearing unusual sounds that seemed to originate from the forest surrounding their camp. The noise resembled a low humming, which they later realized was likely the sound of distant generators or heavy equipment from a remote mining operation or Forest Service facility operating in the area. The sound would continue for extended periods, then stop abruptly, only to resume hours later from different directions as the wind carried the noise across the valleys. The humming was consistent with the type of industrial equipment that might be used for water pumping, communications equipment, or other remote infrastructure that required continuous operation. It wasn't the natural sounds of the forest, not the hooting of owls, the rustling of wind through branches, or the distant howl of coyotes. This was mechanical, steady, and likely originated from facilities that operated around the clock but were located several miles away, making them audible only during the quiet night hours. Craig initially attributed the humming to distant logging operations or perhaps recreational vehicles traveling on forest roads that lay beyond their hearing range during daylight hours. Luke suggested they might be hearing the sound of remote weather monitoring stations or communication relay equipment that the Forest Service maintained in the backcountry. Such installations often required generators or other mechanical equipment that could produce steady humming sounds audible for miles in the quiet wilderness. On the fourth night, Craig discovered fresh footprints in the soft soil outside their tent. The impressions clearly showed boot treads, indicating human presence, but the prints were noticeably larger than those made by either hunter. The tracks appeared to originate from the direction of the creek, circled completely around their tent, and then disappeared into the thick brush, likely left by another hunter or backpacker who had discovered their camp and decided to investigate before moving on without making contact. The discovery of the footprints created considerable tension between the two hunters, though they realized that encountering other people in the wilderness, while uncommon, was not impossible. Their camp's location, while remote, was still accessible to experienced hikers, and the circling pattern of the track suggested someone who had been curious about their presence, but had chosen not to make contact, perhaps another hunter who didn't want to interfere with their hunt. Craig knelt beside the clearest print, measuring it against his own boot. The impression was at least 2 inches longer and notably wider than his size 11 boots. The tread pattern was unfamiliar, likely from a heavy-duty hiking boot or work boot designed for rugged terrain. Most disturbing was the depth of the impressions, suggesting someone much heavier than either of them, possibly carrying a heavy pack, had been walking around their camp. Both men decided to maintain heightened security for the remainder of their expedition, keeping their rifles loaded and their fire smaller than usual to avoid attracting additional attention. They established a watch schedule that ensured one hunter remained awake throughout the night hours, though neither felt entirely comfortable with their situation. The following evening brought a more disturbing encounter when Luke observed what appeared to be a person standing motionless behind a large pine tree approximately 30 yards from their camp. The figure remained stationary for several minutes, apparently watching their activities before disappearing back into the forest. Craig confirmed that he had also observed the person, though they concluded that the individual was likely another hunter or backpacker who had been observing their camp from a distance to determine if they were friendly before deciding to avoid contact and continue on their way. Their attempts to investigate the area where the person had been standing revealed faint signs of disturbance in the forest floor, though the thick layer of pine needles and the rocky terrain made tracking difficult. The person had clearly been skilled at moving quietly through the woods, suggesting an experienced outdoorsman who knew how to minimize their impact on the environment. The final disturbing incident occurred when they discovered that their trail camera had been removed from its mounting location. The camera had been secured with a heavy-duty strap that showed clean cuts rather than the frayed edges that would result from animal damage. Most significantly, the memory card was missing, suggesting that whoever had taken the camera was likely another hunter who was concerned about being photographed without permission, a reasonable concern in an area where multiple people might be hunting. The theft of their trail camera, while frustrating, was not entirely unexpected in an area where multiple hunters might be operating. Some hunters were known to remove or disable trail cameras, they discovered, either out of privacy concern or to eliminate competition for hunting spots. The clean cuts on the strap suggested someone with a knife who knew how to remove the camera quickly and efficiently. Craig and Luke made the mutual decision to pack their equipment and leave the area immediately rather than risk additional encounters with the other hunters who had been operating in the same area. While the presence of other people in the wilderness wasn't necessarily dangerous, the lack of direct communication and the apparent surveillance behavior suggested individuals who preferred to avoid contact, a situation that could lead to misunderstandings or conflicts. Their departure from the hunting area proceeded without incident, though both men remained alert for signs of other hunters during their hike back to their vehicle. The experience had transformed what should have been a relaxing hunting expedition into a nerve-wracking ordeal that neither hunter wanted to repeat. Craig continued to insist that their experience had not involved bears or other wildlife, emphasizing that bears did not engage in surveillance behavior and certainly did not leave boot prints. The incident served as a reminder that even in remote wilderness areas, hunters might encounter other people who preferred to operate without contact, creating situations that required careful judgment about personal safety versus hunting opportunities. Years later, both Craig and Luke would occasionally research hunting regulations and user statistics from central Idaho, trying to understand the patterns of use in remote wilderness areas. They learned that the area they had hunted was actually more popular among experienced backcountry hunters than they had realized, and that encounters between different hunting parties, while uncommon, were not unheard of. They discovered that other hunters had reported similar experiences in the same general area, evidence of other hunting parties, the sounds of distant equipment, and the general awareness that they were not alone in areas they had assumed were completely uninhabited. The forest had simply been more active with human presence than they had expected, and both men eventually returned to hunt in other remote wilderness areas, though they never went back to that particular location.